Okay, so we're finishing up the study of the book of Psalms today, and wanted to thank Jason, who's not here, but he'll get to see the video, and he did a great job on this. And so we're going to finish up today, and then next week we'll be going into the study of Hebrews. So the Psalms of the King. This is from Randy Blackaby's book. We're going to go through some if you did your homework, we're going to cover that as we go through today. So hopefully a lot of this is in the way of a reminder as we go through today. The characteristics of the royal psalms they're all about kingship and the things associated with the king. And we see that there are a number of ways that we know this based on the words that are being used in that particular psalm. We see the words king, anointed, King David, a lot of times is either addressed or he wrote the psalm, or it could be a psalm of David, could mean it's written by David, for David, about David. Those are all things, because David was kind of, for the Israelites, was kind of the epitome of what they visualized the king should be ultimately, even though with all of his mistakes and things like that, he was just a man. There's no special kind or type, and Jason spent a lot of time talking about different types of literature and types of ways of manipulating words and everything, and topics that would give you certain types of psalms. But the kingly psalms, the royal psalms, are not like that. They kind of fall into all the different categories. The only thing that they have in common is they're about one thing: the king. Okay, so if it's about the king, then they fall into this category. The role of the king in Israel's history was kind of an interesting, unique relationship that they had, and it was this relationship with their God. Now, don't get me wrong, the other kings through the years have all claimed a relationship with a god or multiple gods. You remember the Egyptians and how many gods they had and all. And so everybody, if you're the king, then the idea is that you are divinely there as the king and inspired, and the things that you say have to be right because it's from God, and they were the lawmakers and all that kind of stuff that went along. But the Israel relationship with the one God, which again most of these countries had multiple gods, was a unique thing. And the idea that they were chosen, that they were anointed, they were placed in power by God, was something that for Israel, that was a big deal. And the fact that there was one God that did that made it a little bit unique also. And then the idea was that when in this God, people, king relationship, is that the blessings would flow downhill from God to the king to the people. And that's why, of course, you couldn't say anything about what the king said, because obviously if the king said it, that means God told him to. The king was kind of an oracle to God. It was the way it was played up. And so that's the way Israel looked at it. And there are many other civilizations, again, that looked at this in a similar way, and used those excuses through the years also for divine, and some, of course, like Roman emperors, for instance, actually took on the mantle of God. And so we could see how that could be abused. The royal psalms, there were a number of them that used the word king or anointed in them themselves. But the ones we're going to focus on this morning are three of the psalms that they focused on in the lesson, and the questions in particular. We're going to cover those three. There's no time to go over all the rest of them. Hopefully you had a chance to scan through some of those. So as you open your book to page 70, the questions that are there, we're going to sprinkle those throughout the lesson as it's appropriate. The first question was to describe your understanding of the authority and responsibility of the king. So what were some things that only the king basically was identified with? Go ahead, Shirley. Protect the people and rule with justice and righteousness. And was there did they have any authority to do that? Where did they get their authority to rule and to protect? From God. That's right. Don't forget that's where everything flows from, is the idea of the authority downhill. So keep that one in mind. These three things: anointed, selected by God. They answer to God also for their actions. Now that's something that is kind of a little bit interesting in other nations. That didn't happen so often. You didn't see the king very often saying, "Oh yeah, and by the way, I have to answer to God for the things that I do," which means that I could make mistakes. Ooh, no, that didn't happen too often. But in the Bible, when you look at all of the things associated with God and the royalty and all of that, there's a circle of responsibility that flows from God to the king to the people, but then back again. The king is just as responsible to God as everybody else was, and so that's a little bit unique there. Really, the study that we're having in this particular topic is about really a tale of two kings. And it's not whether or not one is, the psalmist is talking specifically about the heavenly king, or is talking about the king on earth, like King David, or the king in general, the king of Israel. It's basically the language that we've talked about through the study of Psalms will make it so that you can make applications to both if you just think about it a little bit. And would that surprise you? That statement that I just made, would that surprise you that there are multiple ways to apply a particular scripture about a particular person, especially as it gets into prophecy and things like that, or not, prophecy or not? Would that surprise you, Todd?
No, I think of, Jesus' model prayer where he would say, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," right? The will of God is done in heaven. Mm-hmm. We know that. He is the ruler of heaven. But it is only done on earth when his righteous king is here as the leader, right? And so he sends his son as the king. Mm-hmm. All the other good kings were just types of Christ. And when we serve him faithfully, we're serving the king on earth as he is also in heaven.
That's a great way to look at it. The idea that you are looking at things from a spiritual and a physical standpoint as you look at these different things. Things that you do physically begin with the character or the spiritual side of your decision-making process, right? I mean, you start there. As Jesus talked about it, if you're thinking about lusting after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. It's the same idea. And so you would expect that there would be applications to both the heavenly and the earthly as you go through. And sure enough, if you look hard enough, superficially, if you look at it, you can go, "Oh yeah, that's the earthly king." But if you look at it a little closer, you can go, "Oh yeah, and that certainly could apply to the Messiah, for instance, in this particular case, if we think about this as that." So it's interesting to do that as you study through God's word. So the king in these royal psalms could be God, could be the human king, things that the human king maybe needs to do to demonstrate godly or righteous characteristics, things like that. The residents. Zion, of course, is used for what city? I heard it. Yep, Jerusalem, right? That's they talk about Zion. They're talking about the where the temple is and all of that kind of thing. But it's used in many different places in the New Testament when they talk about Zion as the heavenly location, also as to heaven and things like that. Especially in the Book of Revelation, they bring up the idea of Zion, and the people, of course, get that messed up and say, "Oh, Zion, that's the earthly place." Yes, it is. But that's right. It's being used as a type for the heavenly place also at the same time. So anyway, when you think of Zion, you can look at it from those two sides. And then, of course, you see the use of the king, Jehovah's anointed, Jehovah's servant. All of these ideas are characteristics that are associated with the duties of the king. And, of course, when you look at all of that, and you look at Jesus then as the Messiah, we find the characteristics are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so we would expect that also. In fact, what we have when we talk about God is the power behind the throne. Ultimately, if you think of God as the ultimate king out there, and when it comes to righteousness, justice, all the different characteristics of God, he would be the ultimate king. And in fact, was that the way that the creation was established in the beginning? Or was that something that we came up with later on and as part of the New Testament or whatever? What relationship has God had with his creation? Go ahead, Erica.
The first thing I think of in relation with God and creation and the king is that when a king says something, you do it. Mm-hmm. And so we learn that by his word, the heavens and the earth were formed. It's just he spoke it and it obeyed. It happened. Mm-hmm. And so I think of that, but then he didn't just say, okay, the waters be formed, the earth be formed, the animals be formed. He exhibited himself as the ultimate king because he also provided. In each little thing, whether you're talking about a little bitty tadpole up to a huge, gigantic, those trees that grow in California, this huge, where they can drive them. Yes. Everything has a design, a place. Everything is so precisely designed, organized, mm-hmm. and has a function. And he says he did it all for us. He provided for us. And to me, that is an ultimate king. It's not that he just expects obedience. It's that he also provided safe boundaries, a design, love, mercy. You see his kindness. Mm-hmm.
All those characteristics that you would want in a king, that you would want in somebody who has ultimate authority over you. I mean, if you were put in a situation where you were totally the servant of somebody, they had complete control over you, what kind of person would you want that to be? You'd want it to be like God is, but that doesn't happen usually with human people. Lena?
Mentioned in one of the recent lessons by Jesse that we are all created to worship. We, whether we want it or not, whether other people want it or not, people can say, well, I'm atheist or I don't believe in God. But then they still worship something. Either it's a celebrity, either it's some kind of building, and this is our purpose. So you cannot say that it got established in the New Testament. It was thought of from the very beginning. Now, God is not a tyrant king. He walked with Adam and he talked with Adam in the beginning.
Yeah, and it follows through, the pattern follows through all the way through. Has that prevented man from appointing their own kings and then ruling in their own image and in their own eyes? No, that's free will. God has allowed that to happen. And even Israel wanted to do that. I mean, that's the pattern that they took too. They wanted to be like the world, and we saw what happened as a result of that. Todd?
You think of that Samuel's story, right, where he tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me because they want a king over them. So that's true. It was God's intent was for him to be the king. But he also, even back in the days of the judges, it was stated, in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so God did know that a king was in the plan, right? He knew that his son was coming as king, certainly. And that statement in Judges implies that there can be some good things about having a king. Instead of everyone doing what was right in their own eyes, they might look to this king. And if that king leads in the right direction, he can lead everyone into righteousness.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because as we're studying through, as we'll be studying through for the next 3.5 years as we go through the Bible and we see that story unfold in there, sometimes we get stuck on that part and go, oh man, they rejected God. But that was part of God's plan because Jesus was a fulfillment of everything that came before him in that Mosaic law and everything. And part of that was being a king. They had to understand and learn what a good king was, and how to serve a king who is worthy of that and of that respect and everything. And so the Psalms here, the royal Psalms, give us a picture of those different aspects of this, which is so exciting that we can look at those and then we can see what that relationship is supposed to be. So there were some unique relationships with Israel, Israel's king, that other kings around the world over time did not have. And we can see them here. God selected Israel's king. Usually in the other places, it was like by assassination or bloodlines that it was supposed to be going through and everything. But and bloodlines were important as a type, again, of things. But God was involved personally in selecting Israel's king. And then you had God, the king was basically the representative to the people of God. And so he's supposed to be setting the example up there of what God was supposed to be to not only Israel, but to the world. And then, of course, this uniqueness of the father-son relationship is also interesting and unique to the Israel's king. And the fact that this last one is pretty interesting because the kings love to take credit for the things that they do. They were, politicians like, politicians have always been. But the fact that God was to be credited with the military victories and everything was something that was pretty unique to the Israel's story as we talk through this. All right, so question 2, we have Psalm 18 here, and I was going to read through some of these. This is such a great thing, but I've got the Psalms up here. But we're gonna. You guys have read Psalm 18. I want to ask you some questions about it without going through the reading, and I'll fast forward through the reading slides on that. I think we will still do the next couple of Psalms. I think we'll have time for that. Psalm 18, question 2. David speaks of God in a number of figures or comparisons. And explain what you think David meant by calling God these things right here. Let's take the rock, for instance. Give me an example. What do you think is represented by this idea of the rock? Solid. Okay, rock solid. That's right. Okay, that's a good one. How about strength? Okay, trust, steadfastness, right? That they're going through. How about the fortress part? What comes to mind when you think of God, of a king as a fortress? Okay. Back in the day when this was written, how important were fortresses in the strength of a nation? Yeah, it was a physical example of how the strength of the kingdom basically was. How big are the walls? How magnificent are the all that kind of stuff. So, deliverer, refuge, shield. You can see all of these different characteristics that are associated with this, and of course in Psalm 18, as you went through there, all these different examples and characteristics are described here. And talking about when you're talking about God and that relationship. So when we get to question 3, in Psalm 18, how does David describe how God responded to his cries for help? And there was a process that went through as this cry for help went out. There was a kind of a process that went through. What was the first thing that happened that God did in the way of a response?
Earth shook and trembled. The foundation also of the hills moved and were shaken because of his worth.
So we have a physical response by God as far as the example here is. It's something that people would go, whoa, there's the power of, like the snowstorm they were talking about. The power of Mother Nature, the power of God. Well, what caused God to do this? What is the first step in responding to somebody that says something to you?
Back up in verse 3, he says that he called upon the Lord and he saved him from his enemies. And then he goes into detail of what happened. But then I think that verse 20 is key. He says he rewarded me because of my righteousness.
Okay. Well, what's the first thing that has to happen in any process of communication between two different entities? If one person is talking, what's the other person need to do? Listen. Okay. So basically, you got the idea that God, the God of the universe, would respond to cries for help means that God is listening. God heard here. I love you, Lord, my strength. He's talking to him, my God, my refuge, my shield, my strong. I call upon you. The ropes of death are. And he goes on and as he describes, and I cried to help, and he, in verse 6, and he heard my voice from his temple. He wasn't too busy listening. And then he got into the things that were being talked about right there by Shirley. He became angry because of what was happening to his people, right? What did he do after that? He heard, he became angry, and he responded how? It gets into Ray's part. The fire, the earthquakes, all of these things of judgment that come in. And it goes on and on in 18 there. Yeah, he fought. He fought with all of his might against the evil that was occurring. And then, after all of that, we see the tenderness of God, and that was what you talked about in verse 20 over there, where he's then rescued the righteous. And so this is a God that not only hears but understands. He's got emotion, and he responds. He responds like a God would, and then to rescue those that are his. So this idea of justice and righteousness that's being talked about here in connection with God and with the king and the role of the king this idea that there's a heavenly throne that's above us, that's above all authority on earth. And that throne of God in heaven was established on justice, founded on justice. The idea of justice brings out what two concepts in mind? The idea of justice.
Reward and
Punishment for the guilty.
punishment. Yes. Now you
Tie that with righteousness. What does righteousness add to that mix? What does righteousness mean?
That the Lord recompense me according to my righteousness.
okay.
According to righteousness.
So what is righteousness? And how does that bring? How
How
does
does it affect this mix of justice? Okay, it's God's word, which is what?
His mercy.
yes.
That's this effect. God's word is the truth. All right. Is it possible not to do the truth? For us, it is, right? That's called a lie. But can God lie? No, because God is righteous. So if righteousness is doing the right thing, it's the truth, and you're always doing the right thing, then when it comes to justice, what can you expect? It will always be the right decision. And is that good or bad? If you're doing the right thing, it's good. If you're doing the wrong thing, it's bad. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Now, do you see the importance and the power of the idea of the king? Because God is the king. First of all, the heavenly throne is founded on justice. And then the characteristic of God is righteousness, to do the right thing. And so the earthly king is supposed to mirror the characteristics of God. So the earthly king is supposed to be doing the same thing. And of course, he's human and they make mistakes, and it doesn't always happen. And so we have to look to heaven for the perfect example. The most important responsibility, I think, I can't remember what Shirley talked about this earlier, this idea of protecting the people. Why is protecting the people under your control and authority, those that are under your sovereignty as the king, why is that the most important thing that a king has as a responsibility?
The child.
Okay. And
What's the characteristic of a little baby?
Dependent on his children.
completely.
Dependent. The ultimate king has the ultimate authority over you and me. We talked about this earlier. And so if you're going to willingly submit and subject yourself to the ultimate authority, you want that ultimate authority to be just. You want them to be righteous, to enact justice. And because you're putting all your eggs in one basket with that, all right? And with the person that has the ability to smash all those eggs, it's all there. So defending the defenseless, helping the needy, this is the number one priority of the king. And this was a quote that Ronald Reagan pulled this concept out of the Bible back in the 1980s when he was talking about the idea of what the role of government is, and the idea was exactly this: to protect the people. So we would hope that would be something that would work with that. So then we get to the Messiah, the idea of the Messiah. The definition of the term Messiah, of course, is the anointed one. And this is the anointed one. Remember earlier we talked about that was the term, one of the terms that was used for the king. The king was anointed. He was the one that was anointed, makes him the anointed one. Okay, so the Messiah then basically defined all of the characteristics about the Messiah in the Bible, define what the future perfect king of Israel was going to be, the spiritual king. And of course, it was fulfilled in Jesus. And so that brings us to Psalm 45. Psalm 45. And I'm sorry, I was going to go through and have us read this, but we're in the same problem that we have with all this. So I want to get through all the points. And all right, so let's go to the questions. I hope you guys read 45. We'll go back to 45 if we need to here, because it says, carefully read Psalm 45 and list the reasons that you believe the psalm is to be speaking. I didn't like this question in particular, but I knew you were going to do it, and it is a question that makes you kind of go in and really look deeply at this. And it's the idea of the characteristics of a human king and Jesus, the Messiah. In this, in looking at Psalm 45, did you see the Messiah? Did you see the human king? Or did you see, could be either one? And okay, give me one example of where you thought it would be. Yeah, that sounds like you're talking about the human king.
Talking about the marriage to his lover.
Okay, so that definitely could be associated with human beings, right? Okay. Now, let's just take that one example. When the relationship between Jesus and his church is described, it's talked about as what relationship? The church is the bride of Christ, okay? So you have the marriage relationship is talked about, and when we're talking about, and in that particular part of Psalm 45, you got, in talking about that, when you look at it from the bride being the church, you can see the thread of the Messiah in there. And if you look at it the other way, you can see all the mistakes that David made with as what he's supposed to be doing. All the human characteristics are in there too. So it's fascinating to be able to go through and see all those different aspects. And that's just the study in and of itself. But let's go on to question 6 now. During the time prior to the cross, how did God prove himself to be the king over the earth and not merely a local or a national God? And can you think of any examples in history that would illustrate this point? What was the main thing that if you looked at history that you go, yeah, God definitely had an impact there? Give me one example, Francis.
So, the flood? Okay.
I would say yes. Absolutely. So physical events that occurred that were in nature, okay? And some of which could even be called supernatural, right? So miracles would be an example of that. Although the flood wasn't a miracle, it was just climate change, right? So we have that. Okay, what else do we have? What else, Jesse?
Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar repeatedly, that he rules in the kingdoms of men and he appoints them there, etc.
Okay, the rise and fall of nations. Yeah, I clicked on that one.
Just because it was an easy one. For examples, I mean, you can go through the Bible history, and what is the Bible history when you look at it from the rise and fall of kings and nations? I mean, just think about it. Starting right at the beginning and right on through, you see God's hand in that at every turn. Let me ask you a question. Does God? Oh, what?
A different standpoint.
Okay, go ahead.
But I put down Mark 15:2.
Okay, which is?
Where he was before Pilate, and when Pilate asked him if he was the king of the Jews, and he said, "Thou sayest right." So I took it from that point of view, and I also got Luke 11:29 through 31, and John 19:19 through 22.
Okay.
And that's telling of his saying that he was the king and showing he was the king.
Right, so you talk about in the New Testament era, we actually have a spiritual
But it was
kingdom.
before the cross.
It was
Before the cross, exactly. Yes, because so he was describing the spiritual kingdom. So the question is, does God operate today in the spiritual and the physical kingdoms? Does God operate today in the spiritual and the physical kingdoms? Right. I mean, there's multiple things that are, and how is it that he would operate today in the physical kingdom? For instance, give me an example. Okay. I'm going to ask the engineer in the back. Go ahead.
Back then, he cared about the souls and what men were doing, whether they were Jew or not. He sent Jonah to Nineveh, which is not a Jewish city, because he cared about the souls of humanity across the world. And he does the same thing today. If a tyrant or somebody that comes up that is abhorrent to God and his will and his way, he finds a way to replace them, and he uses other nations to do it. And he's always done this.
okay. Well, so
Okay, Jesse, go ahead. Yeah.
Solely subject to the higher powers, for there be no power, but we know God ordained. Right?
Okay. Yeah. And how about the physical laws of nature? It says that Jesus holds everything together. He's talking about
Physical laws, the laws that go on. I mean, the snowstorm that happened for a reason, because of the physical laws that are associated with what goes on. So God's always operated in that, and if you do the right things, associate in relationship to the physical laws, you do okay. If you do the wrong thing in relationship to the physical laws, it doesn't work out too well for you. Okay, so you go outside, it's 40 degrees below zero, you don't put any clothes on, you're going to die. That's the physical laws associated with you dying. But if you take advantage of those laws and stuff, God's active in the spiritual, God's active in the physical through many different ways. I always love this one, this quote from Ben Franklin, where he said at the Constitutional Convention, "God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, neither can a kingdom rise without his aid." And this is somebody who wasn't a Christian, but he could see the world, the physical. He understood the physical world, so he knew there was a God, and he just didn't know what to do with that information. But that's a true statement right there. And so when you talk about the significance of the idea of the King of Kings, if you understand the idea that the idea of a heavenly king is above all, above everything on this earth. There's no higher thing than that. And when you talk about the King of Kings, do you see the significance of that title? Well, who was given that title? Right. Who was given that title? Jesus was. Yeah.
We just studied down in the junior high class. We went through the nitty-gritty detail of the resurrection, and it just really hit me hard, because it's after his resurrection, he appears, he leads the apostles up on the mountain. That's when it's right after his resurrection. That's when he tells them, all authority has been given to me. And this is what you do with this authority. You go out and you tell others what I can do for you, because I just raised up from the dead. I mean, that's our king. That's our King of Kings.
Yeah, it is significant. That title is really important. So, and from Psalm 72, as we finish up, what linkage do you see between righteousness and peace? And as we looked through Psalm 72 here, and we talked about the idea of righteousness and how it affects justice. Well, we're getting to 9:45, so the idea that there is no peace without righteous judgment, justice and judgment is the key behind society and basically things working. There's a certain assumption that in society that we're going to do the right thing. We're going to follow the law. And as a result of that, we'll be able to live with each other. And if the law is God's law, then you can see that raises it up to an even higher standard than that. And then if you get the lawmakers understanding that God is above them and they have to respond, they're responsible to him, now it takes it to a whole nother level. So it's a wonderful system that's in there. Both of these are blessings from God. So there you go. Thank you for helping me out with this class. Next Sunday, we'll start in the book of Hebrews. And if you haven't gotten your book yet, they're up here on this left corner.